I'm happy to welcome Mr. David Spooner, partner and of Barnes and Thornburg. He will be talking a little bit about the analysis and impacts of the Endless Frontiers Act. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Spooner.
Thank you, Colin. I suppose I should take a moment to share my screen, and folks could be patient just for a moment. My job today, as Colin mentioned, is to provide an overview of the substance and of the impacts of the so-called Endless Frontiers Act, which really isn't called the Endless Frontiers Act anymore. I'll try to be succinct. I'll give an overview of where the bill is, and then summarize the provision and try to give a prognosis of the prospects of the bill's passage. The bill, as we'll see in a moment, has morphed into what they call on the Hill a Christmas tree. It's a gargantuan bill. You can see at the bottom of the slide, it's now 2,376 pages long and contains a lot more than China-related provisions, but some of the non-China related provisions are important to U.S. manufacturers. So I'll touch on a few of those provisions as well. But the Endless Frontiers Act began life as a somewhat modest bill that provided grants for R&D and for regional technology development via the National Science Foundation, the Commerce Department, the Energy Department, and NASA. As you can see here on the second bullet point on the slide, that portion of the bill would authorize $120 billion over 5 years in grants related to fundamental research, STEM education, economic or regional economic development grants for high-tech hubs and that sort of thing. The notion of the original bill originated in supposed competition with China. The notion and the bill was very much pushed by one of Indiana's senators, Senator Todd Young, was that China is doing a good job in terms of developing high tech, particularly AI, and the U.S. was falling behind, and that China did a better job than the United States at coordinating research at universities with government goals and coordinating government support of high-tech development in the private sector, and that the U.S. should in some ways emulate China and focus efforts and provide more resources. That's how the bill began. The bill, again, has morphed into so much more, and we'll touch on that. I should say the final bill, when it passed the Senate, is now called the Innovation and Competition Act of 2021. It shows you that trade and China are not necessarily partisan or liberal conservative issues. If you look at the vote on the bill on the Senate floor, it's really kind of fascinating. And I have a note here in the fourth bullet point. You see that the no votes included Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, of course, is probably as liberal as you can get, and Tommy Tuberville, a Republican senator from Alabama, who's probably about as conservative and as much of a Trump supporter as you can get. But then the yes votes included Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, who again is about as liberal as you can get, and Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate. So it really is fascinating. Most of the no votes were Republican votes, not Democrats, but still, if you look at the vote breakdown, you see that it's not a Democrat-Republican issue. It's not a liberal-conservative issue. And it's worth noting, again, the bill is so long, the final section is section 77,001. And the table of contents is 45 pages. So in preparing this presentation, I had to do a little bit of editorial choices. I tried to pick out the main provisions. I won't tell you, for example, about a provision which temporarily waives duties on imported licorice extract, or another provision which cracks down on the importation of shark fins for shark fin soup. But again, I tried to touch on the more major provisions. And we'll begin with the China-related provisions. To give a little bit of brief background, as probably everyone in our meeting knows, the Trump administration in 4 tranches beginning in 2018 imposed so-called Section 301 tariffs on imports from China to retaliate against supposed Chinese government policies that impinge upon U.S. intellectual property rights. At the same time, the Trump administration allowed, for a very limited period of time, U.S. companies to ask for product exclusions from these tariffs. That window of opportunity to ask for product exclusions ended months and months ago. And again, many of you are probably involved in this. U.S. industry has been clamoring for another opportunity to obtain product exclusions. The bill would require the Biden administration to do so. And I should say this is against the backdrop of the Biden administration saying they intend to do so, but moving quite slowly to adopt a new product exclusion procedure. As you note here, the bill, if it becomes law, it passed the Senate and is now pending in the House, would require USTR to permit product exclusions from the China Section 301 tariffs, would have those product exclusions be valid for 18 months, and then sets a number of criteria that USTR is required to abide by when considering product exclusion requests. Those criteria are very vague and give USTR quite a bit of wiggle room, as you can see here. USTR is supposed to grant an exclusion, for example, if the tariffs, quote unquote, unreasonably raise prices. Well, what the heck does unreasonable price increases mean? Or USTR is supposed to grant a product exclusion if the tariffs have placed an unreasonable burden on the requester. Again, what the heck does that mean? But nevertheless, if the bill becomes law, USTR would be required to at least consider product exclusion requests. Interestingly, at least for trade geeks, the bill also substantially increases oversight over the U.S. Trade Representative. And this largely is because of how the Trump administration put in place the China tariffs and how the Trump administration considered China tariff product exclusion requests. The bill sets up an inspector general within USTR. The bill requires the Comptroller General, who is currently investigating USTR's China tariff process, to brief Congress on their report. And the bill requires USTR to brief to brief Congress on China's implementation of the Phase 1 trade agreement with China. This is oversight that the U.S. Trade Representative has never had before. They've always had a high degree of independence. So it's, again, from a trade geek perspective, fascinating to see Congress sort of cracking down on USTR's independence as a result of China trade issues. The bill also would require or would establish a forced labor enforcement provision within customs. We could talk about this issue for over beers later. This is a lengthy issue, which I only have time to briefly touch on here. But of course, U.S. law since the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 prohibits imports that are made with forced labor. Customs has recently begun cracking down on imports from the Uyghur region of China because Customs believes or alleges that those imports are made often in part with forced labor. A bill which also recently passed the Senate around the same time as the Endless Frontiers Act, and which is also still pending in the House, would require even more stringent enforcement or detention of goods coming from the Uyghur region of China. And that bill should be read in conjunction with the provision of this bill, which would create a special division within Customs to enforce the law. Just to briefly go over, and forgive me to a certain degree if this is ad hoc. Again, I was trying to pull out probably the most important provisions to U.S. industry from the bill. But just to go over briefly a few other related provisions, there are numerous sections within the bill having to do with nuclear cooperation. I frankly think some of this originated because senators were watching the news of a dispute between the UK and China right now over ownership of a UK nuclear reactor. But the bill generally prohibits and restricts nuclear cooperation between the US and China. So for those in the energy sector, that's important. Also, and I know many of us do business in China, you'll have to forgive me, I'm sort of the bearer of bad news to a certain degree. I'm summarizing the bill here, but also, and this is fascinating, the bill would authorize the State Department to hire so-called qualified experts who could be hired or retained by US industry as advisors on how to move their supply chains out of China, and where to move them to. And to act as sort of what they call gold key partner makers in the private sector sometimes. I've never seen anything like this in government, and it's worth noting. Also, the bill would require state and treasury and the intelligence community to report to Congress every 5 years on supposed risks to U.S. capital markets by companies that are incorporated within China, and to report on national security concerns, human rights abuses, and exposure to investors as a result of companies that list in the US markets. The bill generally prohibits the acquisition of drones from Chinese companies by federal agencies, and this touches on very sensitive issues. But I summarize it briefly here. There are pages and pages of text in the bill which either encourage or require sanctions on officials that facilitate forced labor in the Uyghur region, or that participate in Chinese government policy with respect to a number of very sensitive bilateral issues such as Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan, etc. Why is this important? Probably none of us in industry on the call are going to be directly affected by the United States perhaps putting a sanction on a Chinese official because of actions in Tibet. But these are as sensitive as it gets in terms of the bilateral relationship. And all of us can be very much indirectly affected by as we know well from the China Section 301 tariffs, by relationships if things go south or further south. Finally, just to wrap up briefly, the China-related provisions. This touches on the professor's remarks from just a few minutes ago. The Commerce Department, where I used to work, as probably most of us know, controls the export of US technology in situations which are defined by US law. Those situations have traditionally been, and I hope I'm summarizing this succinctly, those situations have traditionally been situations where the technology, as we discussed a moment ago, is sensitive for national security purposes. That's been morphing in recent months, and the bill would speed up this change. The bill would also require the Commerce Department to control exports of technology that supposedly facilitate human rights abuses. Technology that, for example, facilitates censorship, or that helps facial recognition technologies and that sort of thing. And so, to a certain extent, US law is morphing so that if you're a company that deals in technology that helps with regimes being tough or monitoring or restricting the rights of their citizens in China or anywhere else, you might find the need to obtain a license, or might be prohibited from exporting your technology abroad, particularly to China. Finally, the bill for the first time proclaims that censorship is a trade barrier. And again, for trade geeks, this is a big deal. I won't elaborate on it, but trade is increasingly, of course, based in e-commerce or digital trade. And of course, some of the bigger companies with global influence are companies such as Facebook and Twitter and such. And so the US has never had as a trade priority trying to penalize countries for censorship, and the bill would require the US Trade Representative to do so. I'll wrap up. I know we're running short on time with the important non-China related provisions of the bill. The United States for decades has permitted duty-free access for imports from the developing world. That program is called the GSP program, the Generalized System of Preferences. It expired in December. The bill would renew it until 2027. That's a big deal for companies that import inputs from the developing world or finished products. Similarly, every 2 years, sometimes 3, but every 2, Congress will pass something called the Miscellaneous Tariff Bill. It's a bill, if we were together, you'd see my animated gestures here, but it's a bill that's like a foot high that temporarily suspends duties on thousands of imported products that aren't made in the United States. That bill too expired in December, and the legislation would reauthorize that until 2024. Again, I would encourage folks, give me a call or call Colin if you want to see if you would be affected by either of these provisions. We can let you know. But that, for example, is where the provision having to do with imported licorice extract is buried. It can benefit a lot of us. And the third point here is extremely controversial. The bill would require companies that sell goods online to identify in a conspicuous place the country of origin of every good they sell, something that's not required now, and which, as you can imagine, is a point of contention in industry. And finally, the bill strengthens Buy America requirements by requiring federal agencies to essentially, there are exceptions written into the bill, but that at least require federal agencies to aim to procure all their iron, steel, and other construction materials for infrastructure projects from U.S. companies. So with that, I'll end. I should probably end with a brief prognosis of the prospects of the bill. The bill, as we noted in the first slide, passed the Senate with a 2/3 majority. It's been pending in the House ever since, and it will pass in some form. But the reason it did not pass quickly, despite the bipartisan consensus I noted in support of the bill, is that the bill was marked up in this. This is totally inside baseball stuff, but the bill was marked up in the Senate by the Senate Commerce Committee, by only one committee. By the time it left the Senate, it was this Christmas tree that had 77,000 sections. And the bill now spans the jurisdiction of numerous House committees. And the House leadership has been, and the committee chairmen have all been fighting with each other over who should have hearings and who should mark it up first and that sort of thing. But whether it passes in one piece or is broken up into bits and passes in pieces, we shall see. But we'll see most of it enacted in the coming months in the House and then go to the president's desk. And with that, I should stop, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, Mr. Spooner, thank you so much for your candor and giving us some of that insider knowledge. Here at ACSI, we always strive to be that catalyst for objective information to make sure that both Hoosier businesses and Chinese businesses are well aware of the facts when it comes to doing business internationally. So thank you so much for that. The first question that we have from the audience comes from Charlie Tsai. He asks, what is the time frame for this act to be voted in the House? And if it passes, do companies need to refile exclusion for the categories that were approved in the exclusion in the past, but was expired in 2020?
Two great questions. I'll start with the last one. I noted at one point that the U.S. Trade Representative had said they would restart a product exclusion process even in the absence of Congress forcing them to. And they've already taken a baby step in that direction. 549 products had their exclusions expire on December 31st. And the U.S. Trade Representative put out a notice just about a week or two ago asking, saying that they were considering renewing those expired product exclusions and asked people to comment by December 1st as to whether the product exclusions should be renewed. So the opportunity exists now to renew expired product exclusions. In terms of passage of the bill, it's a great question. Of course, I touched on it at the end, and I don't know, could be making a lot more money than I do at Barnes and Thornburg if I really knew the answer. But again, I think there's a strong bipartisan will to move it as soon as they finish wrangling over what committees will mark up text first and hold hearings first. I would best bet we'd see it move in before the end of the year, but that's only a guess.
Well, great. We have another question from the audience. What are the implications for U.S. universities that collaborate closely with Chinese industries, universities, et cetera, on research and development?
That's a very good question. And I frankly should refresh my recollection. There are numerous provisions in the bill that that both encourage universities to engage in fundamental research by providing grants and other types of support, and that caution universities to be careful about partnerships with Chinese companies. And the bill often explicitly mentions China, which is unusual for legislation. But I could sort of cobble together those provisions of the bill and forward them to you or forward them to Colin. But the bill does both. It takes a carrot and stick approach.
Great. Kind of going back into that crystal ball gazing, I'm just kind of curious, in the trenches, when you're based out of DC, do you foresee any other policies or, regulations that might impact the U.S.-China business relationship?
Oh, very much so. Again, this is probably more a topic for the reception this evening, but the first is something I mentioned briefly in passing. The Senate passed a bill which would create a presumption that all goods exported from the Uyghur region of China are made with forced labor. That is a political irritant, but it's also a commercial difficulty for several of my clients, and I know industry, because there's no de minimis provision in U.S. law. If this jacket comes in and it contains, in theory, only one fiber of cotton from the Uyghur region, customs could bar entry, and many companies are freaking out about the not that anyone supports forced labor, but about how they would practically implement or ensure compliance with the law. And then there are a number of export control issues which are potentially irritants, including an effort by Commerce to define what are called emerging technologies, and basically to expand to put it briefly, to sort of expand the penumbra of items that require a license before being exported to China. Those are at least two big ones for industry.
Great. I'm going to give people another few seconds to submit additional questions via the Q&A. We do have just a quick comment here from Douglas, who has mentioned that the bill was marked up by several Senate committees, and each title was reported out of a different committee.
Yeah, well, that's a great catch. What I should have said was the Endless Frontiers Act was only marked up by the Commerce Committee. And when it moved to the Senate floor, several other bills were attached to it, and it passed the Senate as a sort of morphed, much bigger bill when it was a sort of bigger monster of a bill by the time it went to the House.